More muscle mass at a certain point means worse health. Yes, and you'll understand it easily. The message that building and maintaining good muscle mass is important for your health has really sunk in. But do you know the risks associated with having muscle mass far above what is appropriate for you? I'm Dr. Borja Bandera, a physician specializing in endocrinology and nutrition. In today's video, we're going to explain why total muscle mass isn't the most important thing if you're looking for longevity, what you should focus on instead, and why developing your muscles as much as possible beyond a certain point is counterproductive. Let me ask you, is muscle mass the anti-aging engine or is it strength? The factor that best correlates with quality and life expectancy is muscle strength, not total muscle mass. It's about what your muscle can do, not how many kilos of muscle you have. And there isn't always a perfect correlation between muscle quantity and strength, even though it might seem like there is. This is obvious even without knowing much about science. If those with more muscle mass were the longest lived, then all centenarians would be former professional bodybuilders, right? The reality, of course, as you know, is quite the opposite. The average life expectancy among non-natural bodybuilders is actually lower than that of the general population. And this is a tricky fact, since we know that the general population is already sedentary and doesn't have very good habits. But the same even applies to strength. They live shorter lives than the general population. However, let me explain why it's more useful to focus on strength rather than muscle mass if you're someone with a health goal. Look, the relationship between muscle mass and survival follows the typical J-shaped curve that is replicated in science many times. That is, having little muscle mass, the start of the J, increases mortality a lot. Having good muscle mass reduces it a lot, but after a certain point, if we keep increasing muscle mass, mortality also goes up, which would be the other end of that J, but it's not because of the muscle mass itself, but because of the cost associated with it. This is the key message. Muscle is a costly organ. Hypertrophying any organ or tissue above average comes at a cost. In general, we should aim to have muscle mass in the upper quartile for our sex and age. That is, to be among the top 25% of the population in terms of muscle. And this isn't that hard to achieve, especially in our current society. But once you've achieved this, your focus should be on developing muscle strength and not worrying so much about muscle size. Why? I'll say it again. If you want to be a bodybuilder, that's great, but here we're talking about people who are focused on longevity and health. And why is this the case? 5 reasons. First, you're probably less familiar with the word dynapenia than with sarcopenia. Dynapenia refers to a deficit of strength, not muscle mass. That would be sarcopenia. Strength is lost, pay attention, up to 3 times faster than muscle mass. Up to 3 times. This means that aging doesn't start in the myocyte, in the muscle fiber, but in the central nervous system. The loss of alpha motor neurons and the denervation of type 2 fibers, fast fibers, happen long before we see a significant drop in muscle volume. Therefore, you can have an acceptable muscle volume and an empowered central nervous system, aged with dynapenia. Second point, along the same lines as the previous one, a muscle can maintain its absolute volume but be streaked with fat, filled with inert collagen, which reduces its density and contractile capacity. That is, we can have a bulky muscle but functionally inefficient, something that sometimes happens in obesity. Third, a high level of strength is the best indicator of an intact brain-muscle axis, and this is a key factor in preventing frailty. If your brain has a great capacity to activate the largest number of muscle fibers simultaneously, your brain is a young brain. Remember, you age when you lose speed. Fourth, the evidence supports it. We know from large studies, like the prospective urban-rural epidemiology study, that grip strength, for example hand grip, is a more powerful predictor of all-cause mortality than cholesterol or systolic blood pressure. And fifth, high force production is intrinsically linked to great insulin sensitivity and to because otherwise you wouldn't be able to generate that much force. And this in turn correlates very well with longevity. And now is when you're going to understand why having more muscle beyond a certain point isn't better. There are some arguments here that you can't forget because they're very important. First, the path to a muscle mass way above average is unhealthy. Have you ever stopped to think about everything you have to do to achieve extraterrestrial levels of muscle mass? Starting from the fact that you need to have genetics that make it possible, and of course leaving aside the issue of anabolic steroids and other drugs. Alright, if we focus only on the nutrition of people who achieve such muscle growth, we can draw several conclusions. The first is that they spend practically all hours of the day activating anabolic signaling pathways. growth hormone and growth factor, 1 insulin, androgens, you know them. They are all anabolic hormones that have the specific role of building new tissue, in this case skeletal muscle, since the mechanical tension from training directs nutritional resources there. The problem is that when the main metabolic switch of these anabolic pathways, mTOR, is activated, other catabolic molecular switches like AMPK are not activated. AMPK and the subsequent signaling cascades are in charge. Never forget to repair unrepaired damage in the cells, to recycle proteins and other malfunctioning organelles, to prevent, for example, genomic instability. What if your cells go crazy and mutate? A life of chronic energy surplus and uninterrupted anabolic signaling is an unhealthy life, whether in the context of obesity or in the context of excessive muscle mass. Obviously, I prefer the second option over the first, but both options leave you vulnerable to disease. Second, cardiovascular stress. The hemodynamic cost of moving a very large body is high. Skeletal muscle is a deeply vascularized tissue, one of the most vascularized. The organ responsible for that function, as you know, is the heart. This means that if your muscle mass, in absolute terms, is double or triple what is appropriate for your genetics, your heart will have to adapt in order to pump blood to that hypertrophied and highly vascularized tissue. Because this also happens partially with obesity, but not as much because adipose tissue is not as vascularized. We don't have to send as much blood to fat with the heart, but we do to muscle, and these adaptations are not comparable, for example, to those that would develop in a marathon runner over time and with training. Let's not forget that strength athletes work with peaks of intrathoracic pressure, continuous Valsalva maneuvers, and heavy loads. It's not surprising that many non-natural professional bodybuilders die prematurely from sudden death. When we study their autopsies, what do we see? We see cardiomegaly, ventricular hypertrophy, and very high levels of atherosclerosis. Yes, that's what we see. This, of course, adds to the direct negative effect that anabolic drugs have on the cardiovascular system and the nutritional factors we mentioned earlier. In the end, everything adds up: bone and joint health. Two of the factors that most damage the joints are repetitive impact and the weight that the joint has to bear. This is especially true for weight-bearing joints like hips, knees, or ankles. Ultimately, constantly exceeding the capacity of a joint is not good for that joint. Obvious, right? While periarticular muscle mass is a protective factor that adds load-bearing capacity to the joint, when the muscle tissue is too hypertrophied, the resulting weight still generates compressive loads and shearing forces in the hip, knee, spine, and ankles. In other words, it's probably more protective to have excess weight due to contractile muscle tissue than due to adipose tissue. But let's not fool ourselves. In both cases, the joint is overloaded and its deterioration will be much faster. Your knees suffer just as much whether you're Mr. Olympia or if you have obesity. The natural muscle limit is genetically defined and surpassing it isn't free. This also happens with adipose tissue. It's interesting. There are people who genetically have a greater capacity to expand their muscle tissue without obvious alterations. Similarly, some people can significantly increase their fat tissue without harming their metabolic health. Reaching a weight of 300, 400, or 500 kilos is not something everyone can do. You probably can't do it even if you eat all day long. But the more we surpass our natural genetic limit through artificial interventions, the more our body complains. And it complains by trying to bring you back to homeostasis. And I say artificial interventions because remember that in nature, extremely muscular phenotypes don't exist. This is something that movies have put into our heads. But Roman gladiators like Boagrio in the movie Troy only exist in movies. That kind of muscle mass doesn't exist naturally in nature. Remember, creating new muscle is extremely difficult because it's a very complex tissue to maintain. All those resources you're going to use to maintain muscle mass won't be available for other maintenance, monitoring, or repair processes for your health. Think, for example, about immune surveillance, which also requires a lot of energy. Ultimately, paradoxically, having extremely large muscle mass makes you very vulnerable. Also think about this. Muscle can also contribute to chronic inflammation. How? Muscle? Yes. A healthy muscle produces myokines that are generally beneficial, that's true. But just like in adipose tissue, muscle doesn't always produce good substances. When hypertrophy is excessive or is accompanied by repeated muscle damage, such as that caused by very intense training, overuse, or abuse of anabolic steroids, there is an increase in the expression of pro-inflammatory myokines from the muscle, such as interleukin-6 or tumor necrosis factor alpha. And finally, think about the ecosystem that surrounds extreme muscle mass. Because despite all of that, the problem here, the culprit, is not just the muscle, it's the ecosystem that surrounds that excessive growth. Think about anabolic steroids, think about growth hormone, think about insulin, stimulants, chronic periods of surplus that sometimes last for years, dehydration, aggressive cuts, high hematocrit, high blood pressure, social isolation. That's what's really dangerous. And also, extreme muscle mass makes sleep apnea much more likely. You may have seen elite bodybuilders using a machine for sleep apnea at night. It's the continuous positive airway pressure. This occurs because their large neck circumference increases the risk of obstructive sleep apnea. In other words, it causes the airway to collapse during sleep, making us snore and have this problem, and it's worth mentioning that obstructive sleep apnea is a major cardiovascular risk factor. So, how much muscle mass is optimal in terms of longevity? That's the question, not just more is better. Here, the medical literature is quite clear. A fat-free mass index, look it up, of approximately 20 to 25 kDm2 in adult males is associated with the lowest risk of mortality and the best metabolic profile. Fat-free mass index values above 25 kg1m2 are uncommon in natural athletes and are considered the upper physiological limit in most sports and natural training. Does that mean that I, being natural, can't have 27? Yes, you can have 27, but you'll be far to the right of the bell curve. You'll be well above the 90th percentile. And fat-free mass index above 25 with a body fat percentage below 10% is extremely difficult to achieve without using drugs. Look, I'll give you my example as of today, okay? My body, let's measure my fat-free mass index nowadays. I weigh 85 kilos, I'm 1.85 meters tall, and my body fat is around 13-14%, probably about that. It's calculated by dividing the fat-free mass in kilos by your height in meters squared. The result, in my case, is 21.6 km2. You can measure it yourself on this website, which is very useful. You can measure it in just a few seconds. What we see here is that I still have genetic potential to increase my muscle mass, but it's really very difficult to naturally exceed 24 or 25 kg1m2. If you want, leave your fat-free mass index in the comments and tell me if you're a natural athlete or not. So, what we're getting at is that the optimal amount of muscle mass for longevity would look much more like what a professional soccer player has, or an elite tennis player, or a mid-weight mixed martial arts fighter, and not like an elite bodybuilder. Professional bodybuilders have levels above 30, which is considered far outside the physiological range and, as you know, is associated with more complications. Samson Dauda, the winner of Mr. Olympia in 2024, won it with a fat-free mass index of 37, just to give you an idea. Obviously, the percentage of body fat and metabolic health associated with that amount of muscle mass is very important. The worst example here would be individuals with a lot of muscle mass and a lot of fat tissue. For example, strongman competitors or sumo wrestlers. That's why when they stop doing sports, when they stop using their muscle mass, their metabolism quickly gets worse. Many even develop type 2 diabetes in just a few months. The benefits of muscle mass are not linear and unlimited, as it seems people are getting the message that more muscle is always better. No, once you reach a certain point, the context needed to maintain that muscle can start to cost you your health. Muscle strength, what your muscle is capable of doing, is a better predictor of longevity and quality of life than total muscle mass. Of course, you don't have to be the person in the world who lifts the most in squats or bench press. That would also take you away from longevity and quality of life. So, putting aside aesthetic variables which are always context dependent, we can say that having more muscle mass at all costs is not optimal for longevity. So what is optimal? Combining the development of muscular strength with cardiorespiratory capacity. I hope this video gave you a new perspective and that you enjoyed it, found it helpful, and subscribe. See you in the next one. Big hug. Keep empowering yourself.